Picture this. A group of young American men, most barely out of their teenage years, stand on foreign soil in 1916, staring up at flimsy fabric aircraft that look more like death traps than war machines. The United States hasn't entered the Great War yet. Their country sits on the sidelines while Europe tears itself apart. But these men can't wait. They won't wait. They're about to become America's first combat pilots, flying under a foreign flag, facing an enemy that has already mastered the deadly art of aerial combat. This is the story of the Lafayette Escadrille, a band of volunteers who wrote the first chapter of American military aviation history in blood, courage, and the roar of rotary engines over the trenches of France. Before we dive into the skies above the Western Front, we need to understand what brought these men to France in the first place. When World War I erupted in August 1914, the United States declared neutrality. President Woodrow Wilson was determined to keep America out of what many saw as a European conflict that didn't concern the New World. But not everyone agreed with this stance. There were Americans who felt a deep connection to France, Britain, and the Allied cause. Some had traveled in Europe. Others had studied there. Many simply believed that the fight against German aggression was a moral imperative that transcended national borders. The French government, desperate for manpower as casualties mounted to unthinkable levels, welcomed foreign volunteers with open arms. American men began crossing the Atlantic to enlist in the French Foreign Legion, that legendary military formation that had always accepted soldiers of fortune from around the world. By late 1914 and early 1915, dozens of Americans were serving in the trenches, experiencing the horror of industrial warfare firsthand. They waded through mud, endured artillery barrages, and witnessed death on a scale that no previous generation had ever known. But something new was happening above those trenches. Aircraft, which had been little more than observation platforms at the war's beginning, were evolving into weapons. Pilots initially waved at each other as they passed in the sky. Then they started carrying pistols and rifles, taking potshots at enemy aircraft. Soon, machine guns were being mounted on planes, and a whole new dimension of warfare was born. The age of the fighter pilot had arrived, and it captured imaginations like nothing else in this brutal, grinding war. Several Americans serving in the trenches saw opportunity in the sky. A young man named Norman Prince, who came from a wealthy Massachusetts family, had been pushing the idea of an all-American squadron since before the war even began. He envisioned a unit that would attract adventurous American pilots and serve as a symbol of American sympathy for France. Prince was a pilot himself, having learned to fly in 1911, and he had connections in both American and French society. He lobbied tirelessly, meeting with French military officials and American diplomats, trying to make his dream a reality. Other early advocates included William Thaw, another wealthy American who had been driving ambulances for the American Field Service before transferring to aviation. Thaw came from Pittsburgh aristocracy and had been educated at Yale. He represented the type of privileged young man who dominated the early Lafayette Escadrille, though the unit would eventually include men from more diverse backgrounds. Bert Hall was another early American pilot in French service, though his character was far more dubious. Hall was a con man and adventurer who would later be suspected of being a German spy, but in those early days, he was simply another American willing to fight. The French military saw value in Prince's proposal. An American squadron could generate positive publicity in the United States, potentially swaying public opinion toward intervention. It would also provide a ready-made unit of English-speaking pilots who could be kept together rather than scattered across various French squadrons. In the spring of 1916, authorization came through. The unit would be called the Escadrille Américaine, the American Squadron, and it would be stationed at Luxeuil-les-Bains in eastern France. The original members gathered in the spring of 1916. Besides Prince, Thaw, and Hall, there was Kiffin Rockwell, a fierce warrior from North Carolina who had already been wounded serving in the Foreign Legion. His brother Paul would later join the squadron as well. James McConnell was there, a University of Virginia graduate who would become one of the unit's best writers, documenting their experiences in letters and a memoir. Victor Chapman, the son of a famous American author, joined the group. So did Elliot Cowden and Lawrence Rumsey, both from prominent East Coast families. Their commander was a French officer, Captain Georges Thienault, a professional soldier who would prove to be an excellent leader, protective of his American charges while demanding high standards of performance. The squadron's executive officer was Lieutenant Alfred de Laage de Meaux, another French officer who became deeply respected by the Americans. The French mechanics and support staff completed the unit, and in April 1916, the Escadrille Américaine was officially operational. Their aircraft was the Nieuport 11, nicknamed the BB or Baby. It was a small, nimble biplane with a single machine gun mounted above the upper wing, firing over the propeller arc. The Nieuport wasn't the most powerful aircraft in the sky, but it was highly maneuverable, which gave skilled pilots an advantage in dogfights. The planes were fragile, built of wood, wire, and fabric. They offered no protection to the pilot. There were no parachutes. If your plane caught fire, and they often did, you had two choices: ride it down and burn to death, or jump and die on impact. Most men chose the jump. The first missions were patrols over the Verdun sector, where one of the war's bloodiest battles was raging. French and German forces were locked in a death struggle for a series of forts and the symbolic city of Verdun. Hundreds of thousands of men were dying in the fighting below, and the skies above were contested just as fiercely. German pilots and their Fokker Eindeckers had achieved air superiority in late 1915 and early 1916, a period the Allies called the Fokker Scourge. The Americans were flying into the most dangerous airspace on the Western Front. Kiffin Rockwell scored the squadron's first official victory on May 18, 1916. He attacked a German aircraft and sent it down in flames. The kill was confirmed, and Rockwell became an instant hero. The French press celebrated the achievement, and newspapers in the United States picked up the story. Here was proof that American pilots could hold their own against the best the Germans had to offer. The publicity was exactly what the French government had hoped for. But glory came with a terrible price. Victor Chapman became the first American pilot killed in combat when he was shot down on June 23, 1916. Chapman was only 26 years old. He had been one of the most beloved members of the squadron, known for his kindness and his intellectual curiosity. His death hit the unit hard. These men had known intellectually that they might die, but Chapman's loss made it real. This wasn't an adventure story or a romantic tale of chivalric combat. This was war, and war meant death. More victories followed, and so did more losses. The squadron moved from base to base, following the action. They spent time at Cashy near the Somme, where another massive battle was producing casualties on an almost incomprehensible scale. The Americans flew patrols, escorted reconnaissance planes, and dove into dogfights whenever they encountered German aircraft. They were learning the realities of air combat, lessons that couldn't be taught in any training program. Dogfighting in World War I was intensely personal and utterly terrifying. There were no guided missiles, no radar, no advanced targeting systems. You had to get close to your enemy, sometimes within 50 feet, and pour machine gun fire into his aircraft while he tried to do the same to you. Planes twisted and turned in 3 dimensions, each pilot trying to get on the other's tail while avoiding giving his opponent the same advantage. The G-forces in tight turns were brutal. The noise was overwhelming, with engine roar and wind howl and machine gun chatter all blending together. And always, there was the knowledge that one bullet in the wrong place could mean fire and death. The psychological strain was enormous. Pilots aged years and months. They developed superstitions and rituals. Some carried good luck charms. Others refused to have their pictures taken before a mission. They drank heavily when they weren't flying, trying to quiet their nerves. Some cracked under the pressure and had to be invalided out. Others just kept flying, mission after mission, knowing that the odds were against them but unwilling to quit. One of the squadron's most colorful characters was Raoul Lufbery, who joined in May 1916. Lufbery was different from most of the other Americans. He hadn't come from wealth or privilege. Born in France but raised in America, he had been a drifter and adventurer before the war, working his way around the world in various jobs. He had been a mechanic for a French aviation pioneer before the war and had learned to fly himself. Lufbery was older than most of the other pilots, in his 30s, and he brought a professionalism and skill that made him the squadron's star. Lufbery developed tactics that other pilots studied and copied. He understood deflection shooting, how to lead a moving target so your bullets met the enemy aircraft at the right point. He knew how to use the sun, diving out of its glare to catch enemies by surprise. He was a brilliant marksman and a natural fighter pilot. By the end of 1916, he had multiple confirmed victories and was becoming famous on both sides of the Atlantic. The squadron also became famous for its mascots. The pilots adopted 2 lion cubs, naming them Whiskey and Soda. The lions lived with the squadron, playing with the pilots and posing for photographs that appeared in newspapers around the world. The images of young American aviators playing with lion cubs captured the romantic, adventurous spirit that people wanted to believe characterized the air war, even as the reality was far grimmer. In the fall of 1916, the German government complained to the American government about the Escadrille Américaine. Germany argued that a unit with such an overtly American name violated U.S. neutrality. The Wilson administration, still trying to keep the country out of the war, pressured France to change the unit's name. In December 1916, the Escadrille Américaine became the Escadrille de Volontaires, but everyone still called it by its new and formal name, the Lafayette Escadrille, honoring the Marquis de Lafayette, the French hero who had fought for American independence. The winter of 1916 and 1917 brought new challenges. The weather was often too poor for flying, but when conditions allowed, the missions continued. The Germans had introduced new aircraft that were superior to the Nieuports the Lafayette Escadrille flew. The Albatros D-series fighters had more powerful engines, better climb rates, and twin machine guns. German pilots, organized into elite units called Justice, were becoming increasingly skilled and aggressive. The air war was escalating, and the Lafayette Escadrille was right in the thick of it. Kiffin Rockwell, the first pilot to score a victory, was killed in September 1916. He was only 24 years old. Rockwell had been one of the squadron's most aggressive pilots, never backing down from a fight. He died as he lived, attacking a German aircraft despite being outnumbered. His death was mourned throughout the squadron and made headlines in America. The cost of service was mounting. New pilots arrived to replace the dead and wounded. The squadron's roster changed constantly as men were killed, injured, or rotated out. Some of the replacements were excellent pilots who would add to the unit's legacy. Others didn't last long. The life expectancy of a new pilot on the Western Front was measured in weeks, sometimes days. The Lafayette Escadrille was slightly better off than average because it contained experienced pilots who could mentor the newcomers, but the odds were still grim. By early 1917, the international situation was changing rapidly. Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in January 1917, which meant attacking American ships, pushed the United States closer to war. The Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany tried to entice Mexico into attacking the United States, was intercepted and published, causing outrage. President Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," now concluded that war was inevitable. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. The Lafayette Escadrille pilots, who had been fighting for nearly a year, suddenly found themselves no longer volunteers serving a foreign country, but Americans engaged in their own nation's war. The United States Army Air Service didn't exist in any meaningful way yet. America would have to build an air force essentially from scratch. The experience and expertise of the Lafayette Escadrille pilots would prove invaluable. More Americans had been serving in other French squadrons, and the success of the Lafayette Escadrille inspired the creation of the Lafayette Flying Corps, an umbrella designation for all Americans serving in French aviation units. By the time the war ended, over 200 Americans would serve in French squadrons, though the Lafayette Escadrille remained the most famous. The spring and summer of 1917 brought intense combat. The squadron was re-equipped with the SPAD 7, a much better aircraft than the Nieuport. The SPAD was sturdier, faster, and more powerful. It could hold its own against the best German fighters. Lufbery and the other experienced pilots took to the new plane immediately, and the squadron's victory tally increased. But the losses continued too. Pilots were killed with heartbreaking regularity. Some died in combat, shot down by enemy fighters or ground fire. Others died in accidents, crashes caused by mechanical failure or pilot error, or simply bad luck. The primitive aircraft of World War I were unforgiving machines. A moment's inattention could be fatal. The Lafayette Escadrille moved to a base near the Champagne region, flying patrols over the shattered landscape where multiple offensives had turned the Earth into a moonscape. They encountered German fighters almost daily. The air battles were vicious, swirling dogfights involving dozens of aircraft. The sky would suddenly fill with planes, tracer rounds cutting through the air like deadly fireworks, aircraft spinning down in flames or trailing smoke. Raoul Lufbery continued to add to his victory total, becoming one of the war's early aces. The term ace, meaning a pilot with 5 or more confirmed victories, had recently been coined, and Lufbery was among the first Americans to achieve that status. He was promoted and decorated, receiving France's highest military honors. But the stress was taking its toll even on him. Friends noticed that he was drinking more, talking less, withdrawing into himself. The constant combat was grinding him down. As 1917 progressed, plans were being made for the transfer of American pilots from French service to the new United States Air Service. The Lafayette Escadrille would eventually be absorbed into the American military structure. But the transition would take time. American aviation was starting from almost nothing. There weren't enough training facilities, instructors, or aircraft. Building an air force would take months. In the meantime, the Lafayette Escadrille kept fighting. They flew in the autumn battles of 1917, as the British and French launched new offensives and the Germans defended with their usual tenacity. The air war had evolved significantly since the squadron's formation. Formations were larger, tactics more sophisticated. The romantic image of individual knights of the air jousting in single combat was mostly a myth. Real air combat in 1917 involved teamwork, discipline, and cold-blooded efficiency. The weather turned cold as winter approached. Flying in an open cockpit in freezing temperatures was miserable. Pilots wore layer upon layer of clothing, but the wind chill at altitude was brutal. Frostbite was a constant danger. Engines became more difficult to start and more prone to failure. But the war didn't stop for weather, and neither did the patrols. By early 1918, the transfer to American service was imminent. The Lafayette Escadrille would soon cease to exist as a French unit. Many of the pilots had mixed feelings about this. They had served with the French for nearly 2 years. They had formed deep bonds with their French commanders and comrades. Captain Thienault, who had led them so well, would no longer be their commanding officer. It felt like the end of an era, which in many ways it was. On February 18, 1918, the Lafayette Escadrille was officially dissolved. The American pilots who chose to transfer to U.S. service were assigned to the 103rd Aero Squadron, which would carry on many of the traditions of the Lafayette Escadrille. Other pilots joined different American squadrons. A few chose to remain with France and served out the war in French units. But the story of the Lafayette Escadrille didn't end with its dissolution. The men who had served in it continued to fight, and some of them continued to die. Raoul Lufbery, the squadron's greatest ace with 17 confirmed victories and possibly many more unconfirmed, was killed in May 1918. Flying an American aircraft by then, he was shot down by a German plane. According to witnesses, his aircraft caught fire, and rather than burn to death, Lufbery jumped. He fell from thousands of feet and was killed instantly. His death shocked everyone who knew him. If Lufbery, the best pilot any of them knew, could be killed, then no one was safe. Other Lafayette Escadrille veterans survived the war and returned home. They came back to an America that lionized them as heroes. They were showered with honors and decorations. They spoke at rallies and sold war bonds. They were living symbols of American courage and the warrior spirit. But many of them struggled with what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. They had seen too much, lost too many friends, lived too long with death as a constant companion. Some of them wrote memoirs that became bestsellers. James McConnell had written a book called Flying for France that was published in 1917, giving American readers their first detailed look at what combat aviation was really like. Sadly, McConnell was killed in March 1917, just after his book was published. Edwin Parsons wrote a memoir called I Flew with the Lafayette Escadrille. These books, along with many others written by Lafayette pilots, shaped how Americans understood the air war. The Lafayette Escadrille had achieved things far beyond what anyone had expected. From April 1916 to February 1918, the squadron was credited with nearly 60 confirmed victories. 9 pilots were killed in action. More died in accidents or of illness. Many others were wounded or injured in crashes. For a unit that never had more than about 15 pilots at any given time, these were staggering casualty rates. But the squadron's impact went far beyond its combat record. It proved that Americans could be effective fighter pilots. It established traditions and tactics that the U.S. Air Service adopted. It inspired thousands of young American men to volunteer for aviation service once America entered the war. It generated publicity that helped maintain French morale and strengthen Franco-American bonds. And it created a legend that would endure for generations. The survivors of the Lafayette Escadrille formed an association after the war to honor their dead comrades and preserve the unit's history. They raised money for a memorial, which was built in Paris. The memorial, located in a suburb called Marnes-la-Coquette, features a 3/4 scale replica of the Arc de Triomphe. Inside the crypt are the remains of 51 American pilots who died flying for France, including many from the Lafayette Escadrille. The memorial still stands today, maintained by a Franco-American foundation. The legacy of the Lafayette Escadrille extends into the modern era. Every American fighter pilot who has flown since World War I stands in a tradition that the Lafayette Escadrille helped establish. The idea of American air dominance, which became a reality in World War II and has continued ever since, began with those volunteers who flew for France before their own country entered the war. When you look at the photographs of these men, and many photographs survive, you're struck by how young they look. These were boys in their late teens and early 20s for the most part. They had their whole lives ahead of them, yet they volunteered to fight in a brutal war that wasn't even technically their own. They climbed into fragile aircraft and flew into deadly skies, knowing that the odds of survival were poor. What motivated them? For some, it was adventure. The chance to fly was exotic and thrilling in an era when most people never left the ground. For others, it was ideology. They genuinely believed that France and the Allied cause represented civilization and democracy against German militarism and autocracy. Some were running from personal problems or disappointing their wealthy families. Others simply wanted to prove themselves, to test their courage in the ultimate trial. The reality they found was far removed from whatever romantic notions had inspired them. Air combat was terrifying and exhausting. Death was random and frequent. The glamorous image of the fighter pilot, with his silk scarf and devil-may-care attitude, was largely propaganda. The real experience was fear, cold, exhaustion, grief for dead friends, and the knowledge that you might not survive the next mission. Yet they kept flying. That's perhaps the most remarkable thing about the Lafayette Escadrille. Despite the casualties, despite the fear, despite knowing the odds, these men kept climbing into their cockpits and taking off for another patrol. They supported each other, honored their fallen comrades, and carried on. That kind of courage isn't the absence of fear. It's continuing to do your duty, even when you're terrified. The Lafayette Escadrille also represented something important about American identity. These men served before their country officially entered the war, but they saw themselves as representing America. They were unofficial ambassadors, showing the world what Americans could accomplish. When the United States finally did enter World War I, it did so with a tiny military that had to rapidly expand. The Lafayette Escadrille veterans provided leadership, training, and inspiration for the hundreds of thousands of Americans who would eventually serve in the air service. The lessons learned by the Lafayette Escadrille influenced American military aviation for decades. Tactics developed over the trenches of France in 1916 and 1917 were still being taught in modified form in World War II. The emphasis on aggressive offense, on taking the fight to the enemy, became a hallmark of American fighter pilot doctrine. The idea that air superiority was crucial to military success, which seems obvious now but wasn't always accepted, was proven by units like the Lafayette Escadrille. In the broader context of World War I, the Lafayette Escadrille was a tiny unit that had minimal impact on the war's ultimate outcome. The Great War was decided by massive armies, artillery barrages, and the economic capacity to sustain years of total war. A single fighter squadron couldn't change those fundamental realities. But in the context of military aviation history and American military tradition, the Lafayette Escadrille was enormously significant. These were America's first combat pilots. They established the traditions, the spirit, and the reputation that American military aviation has built on ever since. Every American who has flown in combat, from the Flying Tigers in China to the bomber crews over Germany to the jet pilots in Korea and Vietnam to the aviators in the Middle East today, owes something to the Lafayette Escadrille. The story of the Lafayette Escadrille is also a reminder that war, despite all its horror, can bring out extraordinary qualities in ordinary people. These volunteers, most of them privileged young men who could have sat out the war in comfort, instead chose to serve and sacrifice. They formed bonds of friendship and brotherhood that lasted lifetimes. They discovered reserves of courage they didn't know they possessed. They made their mark on history. As we conclude this journey through the story of America's first combat pilots, think about what it must have felt like to be one of those young men. Imagine standing next to your aircraft in the gray dawn, cold wind blowing across the aerodrome, knowing that in a few minutes you'll be in the air, hunting and being hunted. Imagine the mixture of fear and excitement, the camaraderie with your fellow pilots, the weight of representing your country, even though your country isn't officially at war yet. The Lafayette Escadrille flew in an era when aviation itself was still new and miraculous. The Wright brothers' first flight at Kitty Hawk had happened only 13 years before the squadron was formed. Powered flight was still a wonder, still experimental, still dangerous even in peacetime. To take these fragile machines into combat required a special kind of bravery. And when you remember the Lafayette Escadrille, remember the names. Norman Prince, who dreamed up the squadron, but was killed in a flying accident in October 1916. Kiffin Rockwell, the fierce warrior who scored the first victory and died in his fighter. Victor Chapman, the gentle intellectual who was the first to fall. Raoul Lufbery, the ace of aces who mentored younger pilots and fell to his death rather than burn. James McConnell, the writer who gave us a window into their world. And all the others, the nearly 200 Americans who flew for France before America entered the war, many of whom never came home. These men weren't superhuman. They were flawed human beings, some of them quite flawed. They could be petty, jealous, fearful, and foolish. But when it mattered, they rose to the occasion. They served with honor. They fought with courage. They created a legacy that has endured for more than a century. Today, the Lafayette Escadrille lives on in memory and tradition. The United States Air Force, which traces its lineage back through the air service of World War I, honors the Lafayette Escadrille as part of its heritage. Books continue to be written about the squadron. Movies have been made, though most take considerable liberties with the facts. The memorial in Paris still welcomes visitors who want to pay their respects to these pioneers of American military aviation. In an age when warfare has become increasingly technological and distant, when pilots fly aircraft that can strike targets hundreds of miles away, and drones are operated by pilots sitting in comfortable rooms thousands of miles from the battlefield, it's worth remembering what air combat once was. It was personal, immediate, and visceral. The Lafayette Escadrille pilots looked their enemies in the eye, sometimes from only yards away. They saw the results of their actions directly. They lived with the consequences in ways that modern warriors often don't have to. The Lafayette Escadrille represents a chapter in American military history that should never be forgotten. These volunteers, fighting for France before America entered the war, embodied the best qualities of the American character: courage, initiative, generosity, and a willingness to fight for what's right even at great personal cost. They paid a heavy price for their service. Nearly half of them were killed or seriously wounded. But they accomplished their mission, proved American valor, and paved the way for the generations of American military aviators who followed. So the next time you see a military aircraft flying overhead, think of the Lafayette Escadrille. Think of those young men in their flimsy biplanes, flying without parachutes over the trenches of France, facing an experienced enemy in deadly combat. They were America's first combat pilots, and they set a standard of excellence and courage that endures to this day. Their story is one of sacrifice, heroism, and the indomitable American spirit. It's a story worth remembering, worth honoring, and worth passing on to future generations. The Lafayette Escadrille proved that Americans could fight and win in the most dangerous environment warfare had yet created. They showed that individual courage still mattered in an age of industrial slaughter. They demonstrated that freedom was worth fighting for, even dying for. And they wrote the opening chapter of American military aviation history in the skies over France more than a century ago. Their legacy lives on in every American who has served in military aviation since, and in the collective memory of a grateful nation that will never forget its first combat pilots.